It's a lovely day in the kingdom, and you're battling horrible ducks, and Atari Archives look at adventure. Of all the original games Atari put out for the VCS, Adventure may be the one that most people are familiar with today. Warren Robinett's third and final VCS game, though seemingly the second to actually be released, serves as a counterweight to the arcade action of its March 1980 brethren Space Invaders, by providing a nearly unique experience on a home console in its day. According to Robinett, who graciously assisted me with information from his as-yet unpublished memoirs, he was inspired to make Adventure after getting to try out Colossal Cave Adventure during a visit to the Stanford Artificial Intelligence Lab early in 1978. For the unfamiliar, Colossal Cave Adventure is a text-based game built off of an earlier program written by Willie Crowther, simply called Colossal Cave, that had players exploring a real-world cave system. This expanded version of the game added environmental elements and more interactions with objects, as well as an end goal. Robinett said he was fascinated by the game and resolved to use its basic concept of moving between rooms, gathering objects, and using them to get past obstacles as the basis for his next game, which would have a Dungeons & Dragons inspired setting.
But I know I'll have to come back here first.
Since the VCS isn't designed for full text adventure gameplay, Robinett worked on translating Colossal Cave Adventure's core idea to a graphical interface using the limited capabilities of the system. The VCS's ball sprite became the player character. The two high-resolution sprites, typically used for player objects, became the objects located throughout the world, and the system's low-resolution background graphics would be used for each screen's room designs. By that spring, Robinett had worked out a basic display engine and game design, and said that despite being ordered by his new boss, George Simcock, to halt work on the project, as Simcock didn't believe it would be feasible to translate the massive Colossal Cave game program to the VCS, Robinett just ignored him and continued his project, eventually making an 8-screen feasibility demo to prove it was possible. Simcock wasn't happy, leading Robinett to get annoyed and take a month-long vacation. While he was out, executives from marketing saw his demo and liked it enough to request it be turned into a Superman game. As mentioned in my video about that game, Warner, which owned Atari at the time, had recently requested that the game company make a Superman cartridge to cross-promote the recent movie. Upon returning from vacation, Robinett was told the news that the higher-ups were interested in his prototype as the basis for Superman. Robinett resisted, wanting to make his Dungeons & Dragons-inspired game, and ultimately John Dunn volunteered to make the Superman game using Robinett's existing engine as the foundation, freeing Robinett up to continue work on his adventure program. Only he wasn't sure what direction to go with it, other than potentially adding a roadrunner to move around the map. Robinett volunteered to work on another game cart, Basic Programming, eventually returning to Adventure in 1979 after chewing on ways to make it more interesting, such as adding new gameplay elements and expanding the game world with mazes. In the end, his 8-screen prototype was expanded into one with 30 screens, featuring mazes, castles, and one big secret. The object of this game is to collect an enchanted chalice that was stolen by an evil wizard and return it to the Golden Castle. Sounds simple, but you have a few wrinkles to deal with. For one, there are either 2 or 3 dragons, depending on your difficulty level, that hang around the world map and will eat you if given half a chance. There is a sword in the world that can be used to stab and kill the dragons, though if they eat you, there's only one way out. You can escape their stomach by resetting the game and respawning at the Golden Castle, but this will also revive any dragons you've killed. And depending on the difficulty level, you may also have to deal with a bat, named Nubberrub by Robinett, that flies erratically throughout the game world, grabbing items and dragons, and swapping them for new items as it finds them. It will do this even if you're already holding the item it's after. The game world also features mazes that don't exactly line up like you'd expect from a normal, logical map. These take some experimentation to really grasp the quickest way through. There are also the black and white castles, and along with the golden castle, all of these have a specific key you need to open the gate in the first place. Other items on the game world include the bridge, which can be used to traverse a wall, and a magnet, which will draw all other items to it and is useful for getting things stuck in walls free. The magnet was designed to resolve just that particular bug during development, while the bat exists to keep the game from becoming too static from playthrough to playthrough. Robinett decided to limit the audio cues to only when events were happening in the game, A sound effect when picking up or dropping an object, sounds for the dragons attacking and eating the player, and another for when they die. And finally, a little tune that plays when the chalice is brought back to the Golden Castle. The duck-like dragons themselves deserve a special mention as being one of the first examples of computer opponents exhibiting unique personality traits and goals. Yorgel, the yellow dragon, primarily guards the chalice but will wander the game world hunting you or assisting his dragon pals, provided the golden key is not nearby, as he's terrified of it. Grundle, the green dragon, guards 3 vital objects: the magnet, the bridge, and the black key, and as such will generally stick around wherever one of those is currently located. Rindle, the red dragon, guards the white key. The difficulty switches adjust the dragon's behavior further. The left switch determines whether or not they will hesitate before trying to bite you. The hesitation can give you a chance to escape, while the right switch determines whether or not they are afraid of the sword and will run from it. The dragons all move at different speeds as well, with Rindle being the fastest, and Yorgel being the slowest. Robinett referred to the dragon's traits as the chase-flee list that made them seem more complex without needing a lot of space on the cart to implement. To have the dragons chase the player from room to room, he set it up so that they would continue along the same route if they were taking when they lost sight of the player when they leave the same screen as the dragon, providing ways to trick the dragon and avoid it. Beyond the switches, the game features 3 difficulty levels to choose from. The first is essentially a warm-up with a smaller game world, 2 dragons to deal with, no bat, and essentially nothing of note within the existing golden and black castles. Once you're familiar with the layout and how the game works, you can finish this one in under a couple minutes. But for 1980, this was a very smart choice. The only console game remotely like adventure was Superman, and that game didn't have geography that you have to maneuver around. As such, this gives players a pretty low-stress way to get a handle on the game's concepts: how to manage items, how to fight dragons, how to move between multiple screens, how to navigate a maze, in this case the Blue Labyrinth, and open the castle gates. The second difficulty level is essentially the real game. Here, the player is dropped into the full adventure landscape. In addition to the maze from Game 1, your character must now navigate catacombs and dungeons, which are mazes where the only light source is immediately around your avatar. The dragons can be found in these darkened mazes, which provides another layer of difficulty when fighting or running from them. The White Castle makes its debut here with its red dungeon, while the Black Castle has been expanded to include the Grey Dungeon. Finishing the game requires players to navigate all these mazes and castles, barring the bat from doing something ridiculous like bringing the items you need right to you. Game 3 uses the same map as Game 2, but introduces some proto-roguelike elements by randomizing the locations of every object in the world, including the dragons, who could start locked inside any of the castles. It's possible to find the chalice straight away, but need to search the entire game world for the gold key to get into the windscreen in the first place. It's a neat way to add a bit of longevity to a game that, once mastered, can be finished pretty quickly. What makes Adventure truly memorable is that it's the first commercial game to have an undocumented secret, or Easter egg, be discovered around the time of its release. It's not that Adventure had the first Easter egg in video games. Atari's Starship arcade game has one hidden that provides free games, while several Channel F carts also included hidden programmer credits going back to the original demo cart in 1977's Spitfire, which programmer Michael Glass snuck in with the intention of activating it at stores to show off. Though unfortunately for him, Spitfire's egg doesn't work on retail cartridges due to a minor hardware change. But outside of the developers and their colleagues, none of these were popularly known until the internet came along decades later. Adventure's secret, on the other hand, only lasted for a few months. On game types 2 and 3, there's a 1-pixel dot item hidden in the Grey Dungeon in a spot reachable only by using the bridge. By bringing it to another screen southeast of the starting point, and having at least one other object on that screen already, one of the walls will vanish when the dot is dropped, allowing the player to pass into a hidden screen. Inspired by rumors of hidden messages supposedly found when you played Beatles records backwards, Warren Robinett put a secret message, or signature as he calls it, in this hidden room declaring himself as the author of the game. Atari received a letter in August of 1980 from a teen named Adam Clayton, who had discovered the dot and the secret room, including detailed instructions on how to get into it. By this point, Robinett had departed Atari, so he faced no consequences for his surprise credit. The secret room and message spread by word of mouth in schoolyards and among gaming enthusiasts before being further popularized in 1982 through the second issue of Electronic Games, and the book How to Master Home Video Games by Tom Hirschfield. When Clayton's letter was received by the company, the then current head of Atari's Consumer Division programming staff, Steve Wright, loved it. Wright convinced Atari's management that this was actually a good thing. Players, he argued, would buy Atari games to see if they could find such secrets in future game programs. As a result, programmers were encouraged to follow Robinett's lead and hide their own secrets of their games whenever possible, a trend that's continued right up to the modern day. This is, to a degree, its greatest lasting legacy to both video games and popular culture at large, to the extent that an entire book and movie were based on Adventure having this Easter egg. Adventure really helped popularize programmers getting credit for their work at a time when they were deliberately made anonymous by game companies, both because they weren't considered high-value employees, and paradoxically, so they wouldn't be as readily poached by other companies. Coincidentally, Activision would begin publishing its own games only a few short months after Adventure's release, with authorship of each game front and center. Given the timing, it's unlikely that either event had any influence whatsoever on each other, but this further cemented the trend of crediting developers and ensuring that if you made a game, you deserved to have your name known as the author. The only game outside of contemporary computers remotely similar to Adventure is 1979's Superman, which was built off of Robinett's original demo. By virtue of coming to market first, Superman broke new ground in the adventure genre, featuring a multi-screen game world, multiple objectives, a narrative structure, and surprising visual fidelity for a VCS game. But this isn't to say Robinett's Adventure is a lesser product. Rather, while both games do feature some of the same elements, Adventure excels in ways Superman doesn't, and vice versa. Adventure's game world is larger, and requires players to manage their items in a way that simply doesn't exist in Superman. The mix of environments and screen layouts also provides a degree of differentiation that didn't exist in Superman's cityscape, where he could simply fly over any potential obstacles. In some ways, Adventure bears closer resemblance to later console adventure games like Legend of Zelda, Crystallis, or Atari's own Secret Quest, as it charges players with equipment management and keeping track of the world. And in that regard, special mention should be given to Steve Harding, who wrote the game manuals at Atari at the time. Harding not only fleshed out the story behind the game, but had the unenviable task of explaining how a multi-screen adventure game worked for an audience that may not have played the only other game like it, Superman. Reactions to Robinett's game seemed quite positive at the time. Norman Howe reviewed the title for Space Gamer, noting that it is not a single-screen adventure while praising it for being conceptually rich. He noted that the bat works a little too well as a spoiler and can make the game rather frustrating, but nevertheless called it a good game that is a sign of things to come, though he still found it less interesting and less complex than Superman. Bill Kunkel and Arnie Katz gave the game nearly the full Arcade Alley section of the January 1981 Video magazine, where they talked about it being the first real entry in the fantasy genre popularized by Tolkien on home systems. They write that the game shattered video game conventions, with no scoring or time limit for the player to keep in mind. Even Superman doesn't quite go that far. While they weren't impressed with the visuals, they dubbed it a bold departure from most video games, and one every Atari owner will want in their library. As is routinely the case, sales figures for Adventure don't really exist for much of the VCS's life. VG Charts has estimated sales of 1.3 million copies over its entire life, though it's unclear where they pulled the number from. Sales in the Atari Corporation years weren't particularly strong, as Atari reported only selling 9,150 copies between 1986 and 1988 of the then-aging adventure game. Of course, by this point it wasn't the only console adventure game. Nintendo's Legend of Zelda would come to the West in 1987 and bring a unique Japanese evolution of the genre. Other Western console games, such as Dungeons & Dragons series on Intellivision, Dragon Stomper, Raiders of the Lost Ark, E.T., Montezuma's Revenge, and Quest for the Rings would build off of what Adventure did in their own ways. Howard Scott Warshaw has even directly stated that he wanted Raiders to be the next evolutionary step from adventure. And while I don't have any hard evidence to suggest adventure influenced Western developers making computer adventure games through the 80s, they were undoubtedly aware of it and its game mechanics when they were producing their own titles. The game was certainly a pioneer in designing a scenario specifically for a player to go through and complete a specific goal, with no concern for points or speed, just the thrill of exploring the land and getting the chalice. While that mode of game design wasn't common on home consoles in the early 80s, it quickly became more popular in the late 80s right to today, especially with role-playing games. It's also hard to dispute the affection the game holds in the minds of VCS enthusiasts. Adventure has been subject to several hacks that change the layout of the mazes, adjust the dragon behavior, shift objects around, completely revamp the game map, and replace object graphics. A DOS-based remake from 1991 called Indenture vastly expands the game world. Fans completed and published an officially licensed sequel for the Atari 5200 platform, called Adventure 2 in 2007, that has the same basic gameplay loop as the original, but in a new game world that takes advantage of the 5200's additional hardware capabilities and cart space. A VCS version of Adventure 2 that used some of the same concepts as its 5200 counterpart was also sold on the AtGames Flashback console starting in 2005 and is available in modern software collections. This would be the final video game Warren Robinett worked on at Atari, though we still have one more program of his to look at in the next video. In either event, Robinett left Atari around June 1979, ultimately taking a job doing educational software for the Apple II with the Learning Company for a few years. For his work in developing a new home game genre, he received no royalties and nothing beyond his $20,000 a year salary for the time he worked at Atari. But he did gain recognition thanks to his signature in adventure, which he credits as helping him find work down the line in the field of virtual reality. Adventure wraps up Atari's incredible system and genre-defining pair of March releases for the VCS. Very few time frames or specific games affected the trajectory of Atari's home platform quite like March 1980 did, with Adventure and Space Invaders. And we are fast approaching the next such inflection point with the release of the first 4 Activision games in July. But I'd be hard-pressed to think of any individual games published in 1980 quite as noteworthy as these two. Adventure would sit not only as a special experience on the platform for some time to come, but one that's just as playable now as it was when it was published 40 years ago. If Space Invaders won the financial side of the argument among VCS developers on whether original games or arcade conversions were better to create for the platform, Adventure provides an incredibly strong counterpoint that there are wonderful game ideas that just would only ever work in the home. Next time, we learn to code.